Welcome to the South Fork Sea Farmers Presents. Today's topic is life as a Bayman. Our guest is Ed Warner, Southampton trustee and fifth generation Bayman. I'm Bob Tiemann, your host. Ed, welcome and thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us here. I'm really looking forward to learning from your experiences. Could we start with a little history?
Well, first I'd like to say thank you for having me, Bob. Being a fisherman is, as I tell many of my friends, it's not a job, it's a lifestyle. I'm extremely passionate about it, and I like to be able to educate people in the public on what it's really like to be a Bayman and how it is to make a living doing this and moving forward with rules and regulations and different stuff that have been mandated on us. It's been a little difficult, but I really feel that, I could speak to many of the topics that, you presented me with your email that, so I think we should just get started.
Well, I think even in our lifetime, there were probably thousands of Baymen when we were younger. I mean, it was a part of Long Island, a tradition. And now it's probably dozens. So we could go back. I know before the camera started, we were talking about your family history going back to whaling, which is amazing. But just in our lifetime, there's been huge change in the possibility of making a living off of the bays. So let's start with that. What was it like in your experience, and how did we get here?
Well, when I started, working the bay, I was probably 7 or 8 years old. I would spend the summers with my grandfather, who lived right across from the Shinnecock Bay, and we would go clamming almost every morning on a reservation. He'd bring scratch raking. He went to the local, blacksmith, Mr. Olaf Anderson, and had a little 9-tooth scratch rake made for me so I could go down there and catch clams. I started with that scratch rake and a 30-gallon little tub I used to drag around with me, and we went down there clamming, and I remember him selling his clams. He would, we would catch the clams, put them in a basket, put them out by the mailbox, and Chet Shaber or a local another guy, Bob Pace, would come along, pick them up from each one of the clammers and put it in his truck and bring it to the Fulton Fish Market. And we would get a return back for a bushel of little necks. Back then, they were between probably 700 clams in a bushel, and you'd probably get about $12, maybe $13 a bushel for them. Now, I'd say 1990 or so, the price of clams went up to 30 cents a clam. So it's really changed. Mm-hmm. But in that time when we were on the water in the early 60s, early 70s, I remember there being at least 100 or more so Baymen on Shinnecock Bay every day, clamming or fishing, doing gill nets, pound traps, running eel pots. So it was, the fishery was very diverse, and there were many guys who made a living out of it. And it wasn't until, I would say, back in the 70s when the stock market and everything started to get tight around here, and a lot of the fishermen really returned back to the bay. And that was when the DEC was opening up conditional areas and recertifying many areas in the Peconics and, in Murch's Bay. And there were probably 200-300 guys every day in January and February 1977 cutting holes in Murch's Bay to go out and harvest clams. It was a resurgence, and that was when the Great South Bay, where I would say probably 70 to 90% of the hard clams in the state and in the country got landed. That was when Great South Bay was a heyday, and the price of clams kept going up, even though there was more and more product being landed. There was such a demand for them. Now we're going to move back to 1985, first year of the brown tide. Well, I'm being a Bayman. You go scalloping the first day of scallop season, which was back then the third Monday in September. It's much earlier than it is now. So everybody would gear up to go scalloping, and I remember as a kid, before I could go scalloping, I had to open scallops for my father and a couple of his partners. So it was like, as a young, kid in a fisherman's family, you had to do an apprenticeship to be able to learn the trades that you're going to employ later in life. So I would go out and literally on the back of my father's pickup truck, fighting off the yellow jackets because it was September and you go out there and you'd open scallops. And I remember the first few times I opened scallops, they used to open it in a 5-gallon tin. That was how they sell them. They used to, a 5-gallon tin, they'd fill it up with scallops, they'd put it in the back of their van with a little bit of ice around it and run it over to Broaden Fishery. Well, you try opening bay scallops into a 5-gallon tin. It takes you forever and a day just to cover up the bottom of the tin. So, eventually you get pretty good at it. So after a few years, when I got to about, I would say, a senior in high school, I would either open my father's scallops or I'd be able to go out with a couple of dredges that were well over 100 years old and that I put together and fixed up, and I could go out and catch a bushel or two of scallops after school. And there was a time I would say that was probably 11th grade. So 12th grade was when there was a lot of scallops in Cold Springs. So you used to get up really early, go over there and rake 4 or 5 bushel before school, try to make the first bell, and then you think you're all day in school thinking, well, I got to go home and open up these scallops. But there was a lot more. I mean, there were all the kids from the college that were diving. There were all the people, residential and recreational people. So there was, on opening day of scallop season, between the state and the local waters and other towns, there was probably a few thousand, people out there harvesting scallops.
Was there time to go home and take a shower before you got to school? That was
Well, there's a shower in school too.
right.
Yes.
The gym.
Yeah. Yep. But it was an interesting, because everything was raced, and it was everybody. As a fishing family, we were always good. Well, the town highway is going to take off. The Lilco were going to take off, and everybody would take off the first 2 weeks of scallop season to go scalloping. It was like a big social thing.
Sounds like the beginning of deer season upstate, where
Yes.
Yeah.
And then we would open up scallops. We didn't have a shop until my father built our scallop shop in 1981. But before that, we would go to my father's friend Chet Downs or Roger Kozowski's. We would open up scallops. I'd be there, and Roger's daughters would be there, or some of the older ladies would be there, and they would come open up scallops because that was their Christmas money. All the ladies that were there, I mean, there was always a couple guys there, but mostly the women. They would open up the scallops and they would save up for their Christmas fund. So, and it was a social thing. You'd have a beer or two, or you'd tell stories, and you'd open up scallops. And I remember one time at Roger's. My father and Roger, they each got 10 bushel, and then another guy got 10 bushel, another guy got 10 bushel. So literally there, I just gotten my license, so I was the guy that would load all the scallop shells in the back of the truck, go dump them at the dump, come back with the empty garbage can so they could fill them up. So there would be times that you wouldn't finish up to 1 o'clock in the morning. You'd get up at 4 o'clock the next day to start all over again. So it was kind of like Groundhog Day. You just keep going and going. But it was it was great. I mean, it was a great way to make a living. Everybody got to enjoy a scallop. I remember selling some of the scallops to Skip Tollefson at the Lobster Inn, and he would ask for a 9-pound gallon, and he'd pay us $18.
Wow.
So yeah, there was, and then 1985 happened, and the first couple weeks of scalloping, no one went out. I did go out, and I did manage to make a season out of it. But in '86, the scallops were all but gone. And along comes the Southampton Town Trustees, East Hampton Trustees, Professor Tittleback at the college. And then all of a sudden, we got Steve Milnowski over at Fisher's Island. They bought scallops from him, started reseeding, bought scallops from Mook Clam Farms up in Maine, used those scallops for reseeding. So I would say probably there was not a scallop, a bloodline of scallop that was before '85 that lived through that '85 crash. And most of the scallops that were brought from other states and were strains that were a little different that we had here.
So everything we have now has been imported.
Well, I mean, yeah, or manipulated, yeah.
Manipulated. Okay.
you know, GMO, whatever you want to call it.
So that's what was. What is a day in the life like now?
Well, I mean, because of working with a partnership with Stony Brook and Chris Gobler and their Shinnecock Bay Restoration, the Landauer Foundation, I believe they donated $3.2 million to the Shinnecock Bay Restoration. And I met with Laura Landau and a few of their people and with the trustees. And the reason they were willing to give the money to this project is because we own the underwater lands. We own the shellfish. We were willing to make sanctuaries out of, harvestable underwater lands. These are certified lands that we had public hearings and we had buy-in from the Bayman, buy-in from the local community. And everybody was under the mindset that we're going to close Tiana Bay to some point and western Shinnecock Bay by Weesett Creek by some point, working with the college in the Shinnecock Bay Restoration, and along comes Cornell with Greg Vivara and company and Chris Pickrell and the governor's Clean Water Task Force. We put literally millions of clams in western Shinnecock Bay. Now, by doing this, we partnered with the college, and Chris brought along his science. He did modelings of tides and currents within the bay. So when the water's falling out of western Shinnecock Bay, it goes through the Poncorg Bridge. Some of it goes out to the inlet, some of it goes into Shinnecock Bay. And what happens is the water in western Shinnecock Bay falls or ebbs for about 2 hours longer than when the ocean water comes in and the rising tide. So what happens, you get the mixing of all these currents, and the larvae of the clams are floating into this water column. So it hits one and it cooler water and boom, it sets and it sets. And where he modeled prior to these sets happening, where the shellfish should set the densest, lo and behold, there are the Baymen out there now harvesting this bounty of shellfish that has come from this project. And literally within a half a mile of where he modeled and put X's on his charts where the shellfish population could possibly be the most dense when they set, lo and behold, these clams are there.
Wow.
So we brought my anecdotal and the Bayman's hands-on visual day-to-day experience working with the college with the science. We meshed them together, and we have a very successful project here. So now we're also doing with the college. We started the first reef that we got a DEC permit for in east end of Cork Canal. We put hundreds of let me see, get this right, probably 300,000 or 400,000 oysters in spat on shell in bags, because he takes the shell, the raw shell, the oyster shell and clam shell, puts it in a tank in these bags, spawns the oysters. They set on these shells. He grows them for a period of time, and then he takes the bags and puts them right inside of this reef, which he has like stones and bags of oysters around it, and raised up the height of it. And now all the oysters are living there. Now they're spawning, and now they're starting to set on the bulkheads and rocks and shells in western Shinnecock Bay. So that on itself has taken off as a very successful venture.
Now, the clam initiative, starting with the seeding and keeping that area as a sanctuary. How long between that event, creating the sanctuary seeding, and having a productive harvest at the site that was chosen?
I would say within 3 years, we started seeing more clams in eastern Shinnecock. But by the 4th year, it was very telling that something different had happened. Because the clams normally set on the northern side of Shinnecock Bay, they were setting all over Shinnecock Bay. They were setting on the beach flex, where people go in the summertime and tie their boats up on the sandbars inside of the inlet. People were waiting out there and getting hundreds of clams, because they literally set all over the bay, which is it wasn't just in one specific area. So literally, and then they're starting to set in western Shinnecock Bay, outside the perimeters of the sanctuaries. So, and we did, and when we signed the agreement with the governor and Cornell, we closed the second area for 25 years. That was the longevity of it. But as a trustee, I'd like to see it in perpetuity. I like to see these areas closed in perpetuity. And I think that by having that done, you always have a very large stock of oysters and clams for the filtering of the water, which everybody is under the contention that it's a good thing that the water gets filtered, which I believe it is. And then when they filter, they get healthy, and then they get nice and fat and plump, and then they spawn, and you're always going to have this reservoir of adult clams there, and the college adds to it every year. We add a few clams. We buy about between $25,000 and $50,000 from Cornell, clams, oysters, and scallops every year, and we reseed some in the western part of the bay, some in the eastern part of the bay. The scallops go in Shinnecock and in Cold Springs. The oysters go in different ponds throughout the town that we have. So we try to diversify every year, putting the shellfish in different areas. We also work with Mark Matthews at Conscious Point Oyster Company. He donates hundreds of thousands of oysters every year so that we can put more oysters throughout the Peconics.
So now the Bayman now have like a history of, if we leave this, if we create sanctuaries that we can harvest from, it is going to benefit us in the long run. It seems to be working.
Yes, especially on this scale, because when I was first on the trustees, we had about 10 or a dozen sanctuaries, like half-acre sanctuaries that we would buy clams from Chuck Stidell. He was Coastal Farms. He was the guy that was doing the relay out of Raritan Bay and out of Little Neck Bay, and we would buy the cherries and chowders from him because it wasn't financially viable for him to put them in his racks and sell them. So he would sell them to us, and we would put them in the seasonally uncertified waters throughout the town. But it was on a smaller scale. We'd do 10 bushel here, 20 bushel here, where the college is doing millions, literally millions of small, juvenile, larger clams. And some of the clams come from Long Island Sound, some come locally, some from Huntington Bay. So we have a breed of clam that is more of a hybrid, not just a local clam. And I think bringing other clams in from any point north of New York, because you can't take any shellfish and put it in our waters from south because of the Dermo, MSX, and all the other QPX, all the shellfish parasites and diseases that you could bring in, but we can take them from north, and that's what we've been doing with permits. We have the trustees have permits from the state, New York State DEC, and we've been doing that with the college and Cornell.
Now, you talked about scale. I know when we were working to get the first oyster reef out here in Accabonac Harbor, the state only permits 50 square meters. Were are you now allowed to go on a larger scale than that? Because I find that tiny when you look at that in a bay.
Well, the area that we did it was in Quogue Canal, and it was right next to where the old Quogue Bridge was. So there was a lot of rocks on the beach, a lot of substrate, and it was a very small area. It was right next to the intercoastal. So that 50 was almost about the size of this room. It sounds very tiny if you look at Shinnecock Bay and Georgica and all these other bays that we have. But in that area, that specific area, it was a pretty big project because it was in the canal. It wasn't thousands of feet wide. It was hundreds or so feet wide. And it had a unique flow of water because it had Quantic Bay and sometimes Moriches Bay, and the tides, depending on the wind direction, if you got a 2-day northeaster, the tides would just run to the west. A 2-day northwester, the tides would run just to the east. But normally they run back and forth like a normal tide and current would. So you have a unique situation there. And my biggest fear was that we were going to put it right or very close to the epicenter of the brown tide. Quantic Bay has a history of brown tide longer than any other place in the town of Southampton. But by doing the clam sanctuaries, doing the oysters, we've managed to push that brown tide even further back, even west of Southampton now. It's going back into Brookhaven. So, and we're working with the Merchants Bay project up there. They put thousands of oysters that they get from Cornell, and they grow themselves in their several grow-out sites with permits from us. So we work with many different entities in many different bays to establish these sanctuaries in these areas.
I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this, but I'm thinking visually. I'm looking at Shinnecock Bay and thinking how much of a percentage, and just a guesstimate, is the sanctuary area versus what's still now open to be harvested?
Well, in western Shinnecock Bay, I would say the sanctuary is probably a tenth of the certified water. If you go on the Southampton Town website, we have all of the maps depicting certified waters, sanctuaries, seasonally certified waters. So you can look on what the area is. I don't know the exact acreage, but it's probably about a tenth from Quogue Canal to the Concord Bridge.
Which is great. I mean, do you think about that? Just setting aside a tenth, and now the rest of the bay becomes productive.
Yes.
That's incredible.
No, it really is. And we also do, working with Brad Peterson and Chris Pickle, we do eelgrass restoration in both of the areas. We work with Brad Peterson the last 2 years. He does this project with eelgrass. He takes the eelgrass and puts it in onion bags that float on top of the surface, and all the eelgrass has seeds in it, and putting it on top of the surface, as the wave action happens in the currents flow, that seed gets displaced throughout the bay. So it's not coming from the bottom where it historically would and just falling directly over right next to the eelgrass. It has a chance, if it's on a good falling tide in western Shinnecock Bay, the current's running 2 knots, it could literally end up 6 or 7 miles from where it originally, started out in the bags.
And have you seen eelgrass?
Yes.
It's regenerate?
Yes.
That's,
I mean, that was as a trustee, that was my first project that we undertook with the Department of State. We got a $100,000 matching grant. We had to do $100,000 worth of in-kind services with our marine maintenance, and they gave us the money. And basically, working with the college and also Cornell, we did eelgrass and scallop restoration, and that was in 2006, 2007. And prior to that, I was fishing in western Shinnecock Bay, and it was really like a desert up there. There was no eelgrass. The brown tide in the 90s pretty much had decimated the eelgrass. I mean, you could literally set a gill net up there, and you catch a couple oyster crabs and a couple striped bass, and you wouldn't never get fouled up with grass. But if you set a net up there now, the eelgrass is, the last year that I fished up there, I'd have to go out, and at a tide I can actually pull the net out of my boat because you couldn't run an engine at low tide because the eelgrass was 3 feet high up there. So over time, by a little bit of an effort, and once the water quality got so the turbidity was good up there, the eelgrass has really come back quite a lot. I mean, it's almost 3/4 of the way to Quogue Canal.
so I've heard people saying that the eelgrass is going to struggle because of the increased temperature of the water, but you're not seeing that.
Well, we have Shinnecock Inlet. Shinnecock Inlet brings ocean water in. And one of the big things as a trustee and our board is dredging of the intercoastal waterway and the channels. The dredging was done in the 50s and 60s with the help of Suffolk County. They had 2 very large dredges. They basically worked 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, and we're dredging. And we had great water circulation. We had good navigation. And it's one of the things that, should really be thought about because, I know a bad way of getting rid of pollution is dilution, but it also encourages the ecosystem to rebound much quicker, because you get more water flow, you get cleaner, fresher water from the ocean that's not tainted by a red algae or a rust algae. It's clean. I mean, first time in my life I in August, I could look down in 10 feet of water when I was clamming in Shinnecock, and I could see the shells I was throwing off the cowboard. That was only something you'd see in February or March when the water was really void of any algae.
So these different initiatives are building on each other
Yes.
to bring the ecosystem back
Yep.
to what it was.
Yep. I mean, one of the big initiatives the town had undertaken with the town engineer was to do stormwater abatement and to have, like little rock catches on the end of roadways. And I guess when I first was a trustee, the stormwater abatement that was utilized was the first like 1/4 inch of rain these basins would catch. I think they have them up to almost the first inch of rain, but on a rain event, the first half of inch of rain is where all the bad stuff is. It's where all the asbestos from brakes and the residue from tires and any oils that drip on there, any animal waste and stuff like that gets washed into these basins. So that they're designed, they've been designed to catch the first half inch. After that, then they have like overflow mechanisms. Mm-hmm. But before that, most of the stormwater drains that you see had a pipe going right into the bay.
Right into the bay. Yeah.
Look in the ocean dumping. It went on for years from New York City. They finally stopped that. They realized that you can't put everything in the ocean. Even though you don't, out of sight, out of mind, it's still there and it's still hurting the environment.
I remember going to the sewage treatment plant. This is on a high school field trip. Sewage treatment plant in Brooklyn with my ecology class. And they talked about all this work they were doing and all this money they were spending getting clean water from sewage. And then at the end, I asked, I said, so what do you do with all that other stuff? And they said, oh, we put it on a barge and we dump it in the ocean. And I was flabbergasted. Even at that age, I was like, that doesn't make any sense.
No, it really doesn't make any sense. But I mean, you fast forward from that time to basically the Riverhead sewage treatment plant, where we had horrible water quality up there for many years. And the Bayman's associations and I believe Roger Tollefson was a big proponent of getting a tertiary treatment, which is at that time as good as you could get. Mm-hmm. And now I think their plan is state of the art finally. And we have good water quality, but even saying that, when you get a 4-inch rain, they have mechanisms for overflow, and they have basically a mile perimeter around there as a buffer around that plant. So if they get a big rain or a northeaster that floods something we've seen the water at the traffic circle in the middle of Riverhead where there's 3 feet of water there. Where does all that water go? It goes down the sewers and it goes to the sewage treatment plant. So they do have a contingency program as far as getting rid of that water that happens to flood their plant.
This is very encouraging. I'm like I said, this is so much better than I think most people understand the ecology of the area. That we have made big improvement.
Well, I mean, I went to the press release for the College of the Shinnecock Bay Restoration because this project is recognized worldwide now. We're like some of the Great Barrier Reef here, and when Jay Schneiderman spoke at the ceremony, and then I spoke, and then afterwards, Jay said to me, "This is so nice to come to a press release. We have something positive to present and talk about." And and when I became a trustee 16, 17 years ago, one thing that I said to my swearing in or whatever, I want to make sure that when I leave, that there are more shellfish in the environment than when I start on the trustees. And right now, from the work that's been done and all the people that have been involved in it, they might make my promise come true. I hope so.
It sounds like it's already come true.
Yeah. Well, the next project is the Shinnecock is working with the bay scallops in Shinnecock to make them less susceptible to this parasite. in the Peconics the last 3 years, we have not had a harvestable size scallop that lives to maturity over there. So there's work to be done on that. But I think taking the scallops and putting them in Shinnecock where the water's a little bit cooler, and we do have a few scallops there every year, maybe we could make a hybrid scallop that we could put in the Peconics that would be less susceptible to this parasite and the warm water that they, have over there.
Has a specific parasite been identified?
Yes.
Yes.
It's always been in the environment, but correlating with the spawning of the scallop, at which point they're the weakest, the water temperature usually spikes, so they are very susceptible to this parasite. I don't know if the scallops that we have brought from other parts of the coast here spawn a little bit different time than our scallops did previously, but they've really run into an issue with this parasite and not being able to get the scallops to a harvestable size at the opening day of scallop season.
Right. Well, you mentioned before the opening day used to be much earlier.
Right.
Right. What caused that being pushed back?
When I first was scalloping, it was the third Monday, and then it was pushed back to, I think, the September, the 2nd of October, and the few guys that were scalloping, and I was one of them, noticed that around Thanksgiving on the dead eelgrass, there were always like hundreds of little tiny scallops. So we want to make sure that this is sustainable. Mm-hmm. So if we come up with a date that these scallops could get their last spawn out, set, but still be able to harvest them, and it came up to be November. And I remember having meetings with the Nature Conservancy, at the Nature Conservancy on Shelter Island, having all the Bayman. I remember Wayne Grothy, he was a Bayman, and he was also on the Nature's Conservancy, and had the DEC there, and all the Baymen that were at that time were harvesting the scallops and seeing what I had seen for the previous 2 years, these little tiny scallops around Thanksgiving. What would be the date of the last spawn to ensure that we have a sustainable and a perpetuation of a scallop? So we came up with the November date. We know it's late, and we did have some resistance from the local recreational people because they go snorkeling and diving, and that time of year it's cold. Because I've snorkeled and dove, and
I've done that too.
It's not very comfortable. But as a harvester and a waterman and also a person that wanted to make sure that it's perpetuated for future generations, we got to give a little. And I think by giving a little, in the 90s and coming up into the 2000s, the harvest of bay scallops kept going up and up and up until 3 years ago, or actually until 10 years ago when the rust tide happened in the Peconics. That was a new algae that really decimated some of the scallop areas, not all of them, like the parasite does.
And people have to realize too that the scallop has about an 18-month lifespan.
Right.
So
they
you're
will
letting them get that last spawn,
yes,
and then harvesting.
Yeah.
You are keeping the system moving.
Yeah. There are a couple times in my lifetime that scallops had lived over to the next year, and you can tell them those scallops because when you open them up, the eye is very stringy. It doesn't look very healthy inside. But those are sometimes the scallops that spawn the latest in the season, and will live that extra year. And sometimes you get big sets from them. At least that's what I've been told by the people at Cornell.
So that's what an old scallop looks like.
Yes. Yep.
You're in kind of a unique spot in that you're a trustee and a Bayman. What's the role of government? I know the trustee is very, very local, but even in the bigger picture, state, federal, what's the role of government in making sure that this is a sustainable industry?
The fishing industry at large.
Yes.
Well, back in the 60s when I first started working, after school, running pound traps with my father, and, working my grandfather in eel pots and fyke nets and, all the stuff as a bayman you would do. There were regulations, but they weren't like they have been in the last 20 years. In the last 20 years, the regulations went from basically very minimal to where you were basically harvesting and, and harvesting to the point where sustainability was not thought about. And then there was a time that pendulum was over here. Now it starts to swing and it comes to the other side, where government realized that, these low interest loans for people to buy big draggers and to promote bigger scale fishing was a detriment to the industry. So the first thing they did was get rid of put the 200-mile limit, get rid of all the foreign fishing fleet out of the water. Then the local, the federal waters were 200 miles. A lot of the fishermen invested in bigger boats. At that point, a lot of those boats were catching and harvesting much more fish than they ever harvested. First off, the technology was better. The nets were better. You had nets that used to be made out of cotton twine and, hemp rope. And, you didn't have the technology of nylon, Dyneema, stainless steel, and all these other. And then you put on top of it the larger boats with the more horsepower and bigger crews and the electronics on a boat. I mean, the electronics now, you could drive along and you look, well, those are squid, those are scup, those are and some of the boats have even gone to the point where they have cameras on their doors. So they'll tow a net for 15 minutes. Well, I got enough of those fish, I can pull the net back. So they can actually literally almost count the fish going into the nets. So that's where the technology got to the point where before that, the technology wasn't there, the ability wasn't there, the fish had a better chance. It got to the point where technology got better, the boats got better, and there were more of them. And then along came rules and regulations, quotas, days at sea, and all the other mandates from the federal government. Because most of the fish that we catch in Shinnecock and Peconic are migratory fish. There's very few fish that live around here year round. So what in the springtime, the porgies come back, the weakfish come back, the bluefish, they all migrate up here. So, but once they leave the bay, once they get outside of 3 miles, it's fair game for anybody on the coast to come along. North Carolina had a very good fishing industry. They documented all of their catches. They got like 75% of the fluke quota, 75% of the sea bass quota. Over time, fighting with our electric people in our offices in New York, fighting with the DEC, sending them to the National Marine Fisheries meeting, and having them fight for the local fishermen, whether it's Chuck Schumer fighting for the fluke fishermen. When he had a flounder, he didn't even know the difference. But anyhow, we won't go there.
Minor detail.
But he was willing. Fred Thiel was willing. These elected officials on the federal and state level, Lee Zeldin, he was fighting for us. These guys that I know personally, that I met with personally, they fought for more of a quota for New York. So now that the fisheries have finally utilized the science and figured out the fish stocks are rebounding in certain fishing stocks, well, now they're going to give us more of a quota. So the people that were in there, most of them, by attrition, you basically got out by your age, and some of the federal licenses you could sell and make good money on it. You could sell a boat, or the federal government was actually doing a buyback program. They bought back hundreds of permits, so they got them off the table. So now that there is less effort, there are more fish. What has happened, though, is with more fish, when there was less fish, the price was here.
Right.
When there's more fish, the price is here, and the fishing is up here. So in reality, when it was like the pendulum was like 3/4 of the way down and going here, the quotas were going up, the fish price was good, fishing was good, you could make a good living. All of a sudden, you're over here now. Fishing is really good. Well, not really good. Well, so you can catch quite a few fish. Mm-hmm. The price is going down. The price of fuel is $7 now. So in reality, there was a point, and these metrics all have to be thought about when you're running a business. When you're in federal government, you're making rules and regulations, they're never thought about. It's either we're going to close this, we're going to save this, or we're going to open this. They don't think about the actual day-to-day living as a fisherman, bayman on the water.
So there's a sweet spot somewhere in that pendulum that
Yes.
that makes sense, so you can make a living.
Right.
Basically.
Make a living, save some money, because, I mean, boats and engines and nets, a new net is $20,000, and you do lose them, you do hang up on them, and you do rip them. So, and there's a lot of maintenance, and the maintenance is done not as an hour-to-hour fee that you pay your help. Basically, the guy that works on the boat with you, or yourself, or your brother, or your father, you go down here and you mend these nets on your days off, on your Saturdays and Sundays. It's you're not making any money, but eventually it's going to make money for you.
There are no days off when you're running your own business.
No,
That's the
yes,
reality of it.
pretty much yes. But I do see on the bigger picture, the federal government and the fisheries, I do see them for future generations. And that's, my son is into it, my nephew's into it. My son is 35, my nephew's 32. So, the gentleman here, Alex, I think he's probably in his 40s maybe. But it is another generation that would be able to make a living. Mm-hmm. And everybody asks me, why do I do the trustee thing? It's an elected job. It's sometimes a thankless job, but someone's got to be there as a voice for the future generations. And that's my biggest fear, is because growing up as in a Bayman household, learning all of these, techniques, jobs that I grew up doing before I went and played basketball or went to school, you're not going to have them. And one of the questions that was given me is the workforce housing, and how you might not think it's going to really relate to fishing, but without having a fishing family, a traditional fishing family where the father or the grandfather has a son or a daughter to start learning this like apprenticeship.
Like you mentioned apprenticeship before, yes, yeah.
Well, there's no other way you can get involved in the fishing industry, because you need to make 1/3 of your income. You need to be able to have a skill set, or learn a skill set of either being a bayman, harvesting clams, scalloping, gill netting, or potting, or catching eels, to be able to build up some money to be able to afford a bigger boat, and then work as an apprentice on a commercial trawler. It would be so difficult for someone coming from, say, some community that has no knowledge of fishing, has no, how would you say, skill set in it. I had to learn how to hang net, to cut net, to build traps, to build eel pots. This is what I did in my basement during the wintertime. I was sewing, and I learned it from my father, from my grandfather. You can go on YouTube, and yes, they do have mending videos and all of this stuff. But to be able to learn it hands-on, and to be able to take that technique on the back of a trawler in February, when you rip a net up, you only have one net on a boat, and there's fish there, and you got to stand out there for 2 or 3 hours in the freezing cold, and to be able to mend that so that net can go back in, so you don't have a busted trip. So there is a learning curve.
And you have to love what you're doing.
Yes.
That scenario there, being on the back of that boat in the winter, out on the water with the
Yes.
mist coming over you. If you don't love that,
No.
you're not going back out another time.
No, your hands will get cold to the point where you can't feel them. Your face will freeze. Your beard will have ice on it, and your eyes will run, and the tears will turn to ice, and you're like, "Why am I out here?" And then other people, like myself and my son and a few people, we just live for it. It's a lifestyle. It's not a job.
Mm-hmm. So how do we make sure this continues? How do we that idea of it being a family thing, and there are fewer and fewer families now involved. What can we do? What can we do to make sure this continues,
Well,
this tradition?
like we were speaking before, we were on TV here now.
Yeah.
We were talking about your oyster garden. Getting people, young kids, well, getting people and their parents, because the young kids will love growing oysters, growing scallops, hands-on, getting their fingers dirty. When you pull up an oyster cage of, aquacultured oysters, there are oysters in there are grass shrimp in there are little fish in there. And finding an interest, that person finding an interest in it, and their father and mother seeing this, and, not all people are made for college. Some of us have to go out in the real world and harvest fish to feed people. We're farmers of the sea. So to be able to get that next generation, that younger generation, that high school, grammar school, whatever it is, group of people, get a couple of them interested. I was thinking on the drive over here, when I was in high school, in my senior class, I think we graduated about 90 people. There are 11 guys that went clamming every day during the summer on the water, plus 4 or 5 of the school teachers. So at that point, there was, it was given down, and a lot of them didn't come from, Bayman families. A lot of them see us out there that we had $20 in our pocket when we went to go to the bowling alley and go bowling and buy a pizza or something like that. So other than running around and throwing newspapers on someone's front stoop, well, I'm going to get a boat, put it together, get a clam rake, and go clamming. And, I can say that I was, a good student. My father and grandfather were good teachers. Because by the time I was a senior in high school, my father and mother helped me buy my first house. So, I mean, you can make, not that you can do that now, because what I paid for that, it wouldn't even be a down payment
But
on
the
it.
price you were getting for your clams was also
Yeah,
comparable.
But it kept me out of trouble. Mm-hmm. It gave me an incentive to get up every morning during the summertime and go to work. And, you had money in your pocket, and you take pride in yourself that you're your own boss, and you get up when you want to, you quit when you want to, and it makes you feel good at the end of the day.
Yeah, that pride in that it's yours.
Yep.
It's yeah.
You have a bad day, you own it.
One of the things we haven't touched on yet is well, you did talk about going all the way into having the clams picked up and brought in all the way to Brooklyn to be sold back in the day. There's no processing facility out on the East End. Would that be something that would help the industry move?
I don't know where. First of all, you could never afford waterfront processing. They have it up in Rhode Island, the Townsend Dock up there. They buy all the squid from all the fishermen up and down the coast. They're a huge process. I believe there's 2 squid or 3 squid processing plants up there, mm-hmm. with probably employ 100 or 150 people, maybe more. I don't even know. I wouldn't even know where to start or where to start it here. I know Cornell Cooperative Extension many years ago worked with a guy who worked for them, John Scott, wanted to do a plant or a facility over at Grumman's. That never came to fruition. But I mean, the cost of property and the ability to land a product year round, mm-hmm. and have enough product to be able to process, to build up. I think that's why most of the people went to the Fulton Fish Market, sell their fish, unprocessed. Like a small scale Corjays or something like that. There's a few of them around, but on a larger scale, I don't see how it would work unless you could get some kind of grant from the federal government, where you can get a piece of property like in Riverhead, where you would have because one of the biggest things with these processing plants that you're talking about is Suffolk County, the sewer, and the flow rate of the plant, because you would need to have a lot of water go through there to be able to process all these fish. And a lot of them would need salt water, and I don't know how receptive the sewage treatment plant would be to utilization of salt water in their infrastructure. would it be a good idea? I think it would give another more jobs for the local people, but I don't know specifically the mechanisms how to make it work. And I'm pretty good at understanding, you know, I deal with a lot of fish markets. I deal with a lot of fish buyers. I mean, I've sold fish basically all over the island. I've sold fish to Florida. I've sold fish and clams in the Fulton market. I've sold clams and fish to up into Canada. So I understand, but I think it would be something that would have to be a conversation with somebody like Fred Thiel or Palumbo to be able to set up a specific area and probably give them some kind of 10-year tax credits to get up and running. And then you would need to outreach to be able to have, you know, I'm saying Riverhead because you have the LIE, you have Grumman's, you have, you know, air, and you have the ability to go to Connecticut, and you got to have the infrastructure to be able to move your product around.
Do most of the restaurants and fish markets on the East End get their product directly from local fishermen, or do they get some go into the Fulton Fish Market?
I would say it's half and half. I mean, when I first grew up, I mean, in the 60s and 70s, I would have 7 or 8 restaurants. I would sell clams to, fish to. My father would sell fish to. Most of the, fish would, they would have someone at the restaurant who could take a striped bass and clean it and fillet it. But and mussels, that was another thing that we would sell a lot of, local blue mussels. Now everything is aquacultured up north in Maine or up in Canada, and it comes in, it's plate ready. We would catch a mussel, it'd still have a beard on it, a little bit of mud. We'd drop it off to the local restaurant, and their prep person would have a table there, and they'd clean them up along with the shrimp and open up the clams. I don't think they have the capability now. I think most of the stuff that restaurants deal in is basically the fish is filleted and it's ready for the fryer or broiler or whatever they do with it.
You touched on aquaculture. What do you see as the role of aquaculture as we move forward?
Right now, there are a couple people in the town of Southampton that have been doing aquaculture. 2 gentlemen have been doing it probably for 30 years. I did sit on the Suffolk County Aquaculture Program, committee for 3 solid years. And when we first started it out, everybody said we couldn't get it done. We got it done. They primarily do aquaculture in the Peconics and Gardeners because it doesn't interfere with navigation. The water's deeper, and there's a lot more area out there that was historic good shellfish grounds, but subsequently is not such good area anymore. And some guys have been very successful. Some people haven't been successful, and they've left their gear out there, and it becomes ghost gear, which is a problem. But and it's only a limited amount of oysters that can be sold. I mean, if you have 10 guys doing oysters, you could probably take over most of the restaurants. If you had 100 guys doing oysters, I don't know where you'd ever sell them, because aquacultured oysters, you're not going to ask, like a wild harvest oyster for mecox, you might get 25 or 30 cents. The aquacultured oysters, they're looking for 50, 60, 70, maybe even $1 a piece. So, and they have a lot of money invested in it, boats, gear to grow them, lost with red tide, hurricanes and stuff like that. So there is a lot of overhead for them too. But moving forward, I think there are other things that can be done with aquaculture. Growing kelp, sugar kelp, which is, can be done in our waters. We have the water's cold enough and it's clear enough in the winter where you could grow it. But you need to have markets to be able to utilize that kelp other than just for fertilizer. There's got to be, can you use it, process it for food? Can you use it for something other than fertilizer? Because I think it's a very limited market right now, what can be done with it. If there's even a market at all for it. I know some of one of the Greenport breweries over there do make kelp beer. So, I mean, that it's a limited market. And again, as a fisherman, waterman, you have to be creative in marketing. I mean, there were times in my life where I was catching sea robins in bunkers, and I would be marketing to every lobsterman out there. Unfortunately, the lobster market is no longer with us because the lobster fishery collapsed. So my friend John Semler, who continued on the trap fishing, decided to market for recreational purposes, for the like L&L bait and Regal bait. They would sell it for shark bait, or for the local people to put in their crab traps. So there are always an avenue to sell your product, but as a fisherman, you have to monetize, make the most money out of that venture.
You got to find that sweet spot we were talking about before.
Yes. And sometimes the sweet spot might not come along for a couple of years.
Right.
And you might be doing this, very hard, intense labor. Because I remember back in the day, my father and I were harvesting horseshoe crabs for, the blood and, biomedical. And, when we first did that, it was, you'd sell the horseshoe crab, you'd get it back, you'd have to put it back in the water. And there wasn't, much of a bait market back then because everybody was harvesting their own bait. Mm-hmm. You couldn't really sell them. But eventually the biomedical field realized that, the horseshoe crabs are needed for their, blood, the blue blood. And there's not a substantial, but there is a market out there that you can get involved in.
Well, we're almost out of time. I want to open up to see if there are any questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question out there?
What's slunk?
Clam slunk.
Come on, tell us.
Back in the Depression times, it was potatoes and a couple clams with some onions. It was making the meal go as far as possible, because back then you weren't and there was a time that my grandfather and great uncles, they actually got food stamps back from the Fulton Fish Market and not a check. So it was a survival mechanism for the local fishing community.
Any other questions?
With the Shinnecock clam harvest rebound, where are all those clams going? Are a lot of those going back to Fulton or up to Bronze or
Some of them go to local restaurants. During the season, I would say probably 50% of the clams that are harvested go to local restaurants and, eateries around here. Once, Labor Day shows up, everything slows up, but Braun does buy a lot of clams, as does some of the other buyers from up Patchogue. There are still several big clam buyers. Ocean Rich in Shirley buys the most clams probably in the country, and that's a lot of those clams go to him, and they go to New York City or to Philadelphia is another really big clam market. Some of them go to Florida, and some make their way all the way out to Las Vegas and to the West Coast. So they, it's not a local clam that stays locally. They go all over the country.
Ed, I'd like to thank you for sharing this time with us. I feel like we could do another hour. You've got so much information to share and so much interesting anecdotal stories from the past. But thank you very much for taking your time.
Welcome, and I appreciate you having me. My father did make a video for the Long Island Heritage. Back in the day, I went looking for it for Irene Tully. I could not find it in my basement, but it's in a box there. And I'd like to give it to you guys because my father did a whole, I believe it was about a 40-minute talk with the interviewer. And it was another generation prior to me and his perspective on things back then. And he's been, he's been passed away for, like 16, 17 years now. And, his view on things were much different than mine, I know, working with him every day for almost 40 years. So, but,
It'd be great to see it. That would be fantastic.
And then you can get a perspective of what it was like back when things were really good.
Right. Well, I'd just like to remind the viewers that this series is brought to you by the South Fork Sea Farmers. And if you want any more information about the South Fork Sea Farmers, go to our website. It's South Fork Sea Farmers, all one word, .org. Thank you.
Thank you.